I want to talk to you this morning about worship, and if you like, I thought, what on earth could I entitle this? And the only thing I could come up with is worship through washing. And actually, there are various passages in the New Testament where there are stories of ladies who came to Jesus and they washed his feet, and they anointed his feet, and they anointed his head with oil, with alabaster box of ointment, etc. And I'm going to refer to this. If anybody's taking notes, then there are various references to this. I'm going to read from Luke chapter 7, but there are also references in Mark 14, John 11 verse 2, where it speaks of it was Mary who came, and Mary was the sister of Martha and Lazarus. There are places where it talks about this was done at the house of Simon the Pharisee. There are occasions it talks about it being Simon the leper, and in both of those cases it actually says they were both in Bethany. I don't know whether there are more than one occasion. It seems as if there was more than one occasion that Jesus had his feet washed by a woman, and in some cases it says it was Mary, in some cases it doesn't say it was Mary. That's irrelevant as to how many times it was, but actually it is interesting to read the various chapters that talk about this, and one's in John chapter 12 as well, and there's another one in Matthew chapter 26. And they're worthy of reading those, but I'm just going to read from one in particular, and this is from Luke chapter 7, and verses from verse 36. And one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and when he went to the Pharisee's house, he sat down to eat. And behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at the table of the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil, and stood at his feet behind him, weeping. And she began to wash his feet with her tears, and wiped them with the hair of her head. And she kissed his feet, and anointed them with fragrant oil. And when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he spoke to himself, saying, "This man, if he were a prophet, would know what manner of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner." And Jesus answered and said to him, "Simon, I have something to say to you." He said, "Teacher, say on." There was a certain creditor with 2 debtors. He owed 500 denarii, and the other 50. And when they had nothing to repay, he freely forgave them both. "Tell me therefore, which of these loved him more?" And Simon answered and said, "I suppose the one to whom he forgave more." And he said to him, "You have rightly judged." Then he turned to the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered into your house, and you gave me no water for my feet. But she has washed my feet with her tears, and wiped them with the hair of her head. And you gave me no kiss, but this woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. You did not anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. Therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. And to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little." Then he said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." And those who sat at the table with him began to say to themselves, "Who is this who forgives sins? Or even forgives sins?" Then he said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." And this last couple of weeks I've been sort of meditating before the Lord, let's use ordinary English, been thinking about what I'm going to speak about today. We use this wonderful term, not having meditated before the Lord. Actually, some of the things I want to share to you today, one of the things in particular came to me when I was shaving this morning. And it was like, well, yes, that's a practical point, so, and I sat down here this morning and Chris says, "Preparing your sermon," because I was scribbling a note in. It was before I forgot it, I wanted to write it down. But there are various things I want to bring out of that story, and I'll bring in some of the other things that are in some of the other versions of this that happened. One of the things is this: it's very easy to judge the fact that this woman came along, and one of the major things that's brought out here was this woman wasting what was amount that came to around a year's salary on an alabaster box of ointment, and she broke it and she poured it. Once that box was broken, that was it. She wasn't a case of getting, I don't know whether you men would admit you moisturise, but ladies will all admit in here they moisturise. And you get a jar or a tube or whatever it is, and you pour some of it out, and you rub it wherever you want to rub it, face, legs, arms, wherever. But there's always some left. But actually, if you took the jar and you broke it, and then you then rubbed it in, you can't use that jar again. And this was apparently a year's worth of salary spent on a jar of special oil. And this woman thought it was worth doing to show Jesus how much she loved him and she was grateful to him. That's a bit of a challenge to us, isn't it? Whether you earn 5,000, 15,000 or 50,000 pounds a year, would you spend that amount of money on showing Jesus how much you loved him in something that will be over and done with within maybe 5 minutes? But actually it would be an expression of what's on the inside of you. And would you do it in a way that amounts to all the judgment that could possibly happen and did happen there in the versions in the Bible? Because people, in the other versions in particular, it's where Judas Iscariot and the others that stood by, they criticised the woman for this waste could have been saved, and that jar of ointment could have been sold for 300 denarii, and it could have been given to the poor. And Jesus in the other version says, the poor you've always got with you, but I'm not with you very often, and this woman has done something for me while I'm here and while she could do it. So you're in a position where if you're going to show your love to Jesus Christ, some people will think, oh, he's a show-off, or she's a show-off, or she's just doing this, or he's just doing this to create a scene or bring attention to themselves. And people will judge you. But the fact that you made a decision to show Jesus how much you loved it through doing what you do is something that Jesus will appreciate. If you're doing it from a heart that actually is a heart of love and honour and joy before him. But there will be a lack of understanding from other people. And sometimes you have to make a choice that whatever anybody else thinks, I'm going to do this because I love him so much. I love him more than what the other people will be standing around thinking of me, because I'm honouring him in doing it. If you're taking the natural sort of idea of that, when you're so deeply in love with somebody you're courting, you don't mind what other people think. I'm not one for being expressive and buying flowers, am I? No. And when I do, I buy the wrong ones. You know, she makes comments like, Teresa will say, those are old ladies' flowers. Old ladies' flowers? They're flowers! You know, so I buy flowers. But it's an expression for me when I get around to it, and it's not very often. But when you're actually young and in love, and you know all those times that you can remember that you stayed up till 2 or 3 in the morning, you'd walk 5 or 10 miles to go to see her or him, because you didn't mind. You didn't mind, and it didn't matter, because you just wanted to express the love that you had for the person that you were in love with. And maybe other people will criticise, oh, goodness me, it just goes totally over the top, or she goes totally over the top, just besotted with him. When was the last time anybody accused us of being besotted with Jesus Christ? Not a thought. When was the last time that people thought we were over extravagant in our love for God? Probably very seldom. I want to bring up the fact that certainly in one of the cases that the feet washing is mentioned, it's mentioned once, actually twice, it's mentioned that it was Mary who was the sister of Martha and Lazarus who came and washed Jesus' feet. And you'll see that in Luke chapter 10, verse 38 to 41. It says about Jesus visited Lazarus and Martha and Mary. Martha was busy. She was, quote, cumbered about with much serving. In other words, she was busy in the kitchen. She complained to Jesus that Mary wouldn't come out to help her. But Mary said she wanted to sit at the feet of Jesus and listen to his voice and listen to the words that came from him. Because the most important thing to Mary was to hear, while Jesus is here in the house, I'm going to be here. Yes, it's right that we have the practical stuff done, And it's necessary that we all do the practical stuff. But when you've got Jesus with you in person, Mary saw the value of wanting to spend time with him. So she did that. Foot washing. Why are we talking about foot washing in the first place? What's the whole thing about foot washing? Well, in the Middle East, it's dirty, it's dusty, and it's blooming hot. And I think maybe we all wouldn't admit it in this room, or maybe you would. Who would admit they've ever had smelly feet? Smelly armpits, smelly feet. You know, there are times that we get smelly. Well, in the Middle East, when you turned up to somebody's house and you've been walking in the dirt and the dust and it's sweaty and it's hot and it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit and you're getting there, the first thing that would happen when you walked in, the lowest grade of servant would have the job of pouring some water in a bowl and come and they would wash the feet of the visitor, the guest, and they would be the lowest person to do the lowest, most menial task that they could do. But it was also a place of humility for the person who was washing the feet to actually wash the lowest part of the person's anatomy, to actually kneel in front of somebody and wash their feet. It takes humility. It's also a place of honour, because the fact is, Jesus said, I came into your house, Simon, and you didn't bother getting a bowl of water. You didn't even get one of your servants to come and wash my feet. You didn't honour me, and yet you expect me to sit at your table, because maybe the Pharisee was able to boast about the fact that, well, I've had Jesus of Nazareth come and have lunch with me. And he would be, oh, well, I've actually sat down with name dropping, you know. I had lunch with Jesus. He came to my house. But the very fact that he didn't have the humility to either wash Jesus' feet himself or have his servant even wash Jesus' feet was actually a negative against him. It was a count. But actually, it was a whole point of worship and honour and humility that somebody would wash the feet of a visitor. Whoever the visitor was, they were there to honour and serve the visitor that came. The fact in this case, they had the King of Kings and Lord of Lords come, and the Pharisee didn't do that. It was even more of an insult when you think about it. That's an example to us, really. How much are we prepared to serve and actually be humble and bow before Jesus and wash his feet, do something menial and very simple task, very easy in some respects to stand up here and preach. But are you prepared to do the humility thing of getting down and serving somebody? To actually do something that nobody will ever notice, because the humble servant is the lowest of the household. I wonder how many people ever said thank you to the humble servant. Very few, probably. So he couldn't do it for, being noticed. He couldn't do it because of the fact that he was going to get a badge, like the Boy Scout, washing feet badge. I washed Jesus' feet badge. You couldn't boast about the fact you washed Jesus' feet. You actually just did it. So in comparison, to humble yourself and serve. I want to bring out 10 points, all beginning with the word, or the letters X, E-X. So if you're making notes, you can write X down the side 10 times. And I want to bring 10 points out, one after the other. Washing Jesus' feet, or serving him and honouring him in the way that we are expected to do. And actually, it's an expression of our love. So if you love him, you will find this should be part of our nature. First, X, expressive. Washing the feet of somebody that was in an honourable position was an external expression of an internal heart. When we do this to Jesus, when we honour him, when we serve him in the way that we do, it should be an expression on the outside of what is on the inside of us. And actually, sometimes it's very easy to be standing here, praise the Lord, hallelujah, but actually be dead on the inside. And we've all done it, because there's always been time in every one of our lives where we've gone through the motions. And sometimes that's good. It's sometimes by faith you stick your neck out. By faith you go, I don't feel like it, and I've had a right old blooming week, but I'm going to praise God anyway. And Teresa was always a brilliant example to me, because you ever been in one of those meetings where you think, goodness me, it was dead today. The Holy Spirit couldn't have been within 1,000 miles of that place. And it's like, and you're thinking, is it me? Or it's just like, and sometimes, and everybody's standing there, and sometimes everybody's going like this. Teresa will carry on worship. And I say sometimes to her afterwards, what did you think of this morning's meeting? She said, oh, it was awful. Oh, dreadful. And I said, well, if I'd gone by what you were like, I'd have thought it was just me, like the Emperor's New Clothes. I'm thinking, this meeting's dead. But listening to her, you think it was absolutely fantastic, and I must be completely 1,000 miles away from God. But she makes a decision to worship anyway. Because she makes a decision on the internal to express it on the outside, whatever is happening around her. And sometimes we all have to make that decision to do. We have to have an external expression of something that's going on the inside. And sometimes you have to do that by faith. Expensive, the next X. This was something that was an expensive jar of ointment. It was not cheap. So when we come to worship God, when we want to do something even on a practical level, is it going to cost us something? You know, David said that he would not bring to God a sacrifice that he hadn't paid for. So he insisted on paying everything that if he was going to give it to God, he was going to make a sacrifice to God. He, the king, although he could have commanded that he had all this stuff given to him, he paid for it. It's going to cost you something sometimes to worship God. What struck me was this: when we actually pouring out our love and adoration to God in a practical or a expressive way that we do with our mouths, with our hearts, it's not a tip. It's when you go out for a meal. I don't know about you, but have you ever gone out for a meal and say for instance, if you went for a meal and you spent £200 on a meal as a group of 3 or 4 of you or whatever, and you spent a lot of money on the meal, do you give a £200 tip? You give a tip on a percentage basis. In this country, it tends to be 10%. Sometimes 15%, depends on who you talk to and what restaurant it is. In America, they'll sometimes tip 20%, but it's still a tip. And our expression and worship to God is not supposed to be a tip. It's actually the value that we pour out in the first place. Not a tip, it's not an add-on at the end. It's an expression. So the woman who came and she washed Jesus' feet, she expressed herself in tears and washing Jesus' feet and wiping them with the hair of her head. I couldn't do that. But take, for instance, the ladies here that have got long hair. And it takes a lot of time to wash and treat hair. You colour it or you don't colour it, and all the conditioners and all this. I can remember the day I used to use conditioner. I can remember the day I used to use shampoo. I now just basically say I use Head and Shoulders. It's just for my head and for my shoulders, not for my hair. But it is one of those things that it's something that we actually are pouring out to Jesus. But here we have a lady who poured out her tears and who wiped Jesus' feet with the hair of her head. And the fact that she got long hair and she wiped somebody's feet with her hair. And you imagine going down, you just talked about the fact that it would have been sweaty, dirty, sandy, and yet she was prepared to wipe Jesus' dirty feet, having washed them with her tears, wiped them with her hair. That's an expression that's deep and expensive. It's not cheap. And when we pour out our love and our adoration to God through worship, it's not supposed to be cheap. It's not supposed to be a tip. It's supposed to be everything that we pour out to Him. The next E is linked to it in a sense, and that's extravagant. Jesus is worthy of overabundance. You know, we're talking here in terms of Jesus, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, who created the heaven and earth with a voice, with a word. Let it be, let there be, and there was. With enough power in his voice to change instantly things in people's lives, change things throughout. He created the universe through the word of his mouth. And here we have something that we're talking in terms of, this is God, this is Jesus. And sometimes we are so, we shrug our shoulders about, we're going to church today, or we don't go to church today. I'll do this, or we won't do that. I'm an R. But here we're talking about the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So, is it that Jesus, do we really believe that Jesus is worthy of our extravagance in worship? Are we really recognising that he is worthy of our overabundant expression, be it in a practical way or be it in an expressive way with our mouths? The next E would be experiential. One word. Experience-based. The fact that Mary, who was the sister of Martha and Lazarus, she is one of the people who came and washed Jesus' feet and poured ointment on him. Why? Because she had a relationship with Jesus, but she was full of gratitude. Who else could have raised her brother from the dead? Her brother had been dead for 4 days and was stinking. I mean, even, inverted commas, even the Jews believed that somebody could be raised from the dead up to 3 days. But Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. And when Jesus said, move the rock away, she said, but by now we'll stink. In the Middle East, in high temperatures, a body will start to decay very quickly. And she said to it, but Mary, just don't open the tomb, he'll stink by now. But Jesus just calls him out, Lazarus, come forth, and the guy comes forth. And would you be full of admiration, love, adoration? I think you would. If you actually saw your brother that you're close with raised from the dead after being dead for 4 days. And so there was an expression there that was based on their experience. How about you and me? Have you had an experience of God? That the fact that you were born again in the first place. So if you were born again, you had to die, and you've been raised again in newness of life. So each one of us has been raised from the dead. So that Jesus is worthy of our extravagance and our expression based on the experience that we have of him, so we can be expressive in our love. Next E would be exposed. Something that came to me this morning when I was listening to that, I wrote it down. Here we have a woman who, in the version we read there in Luke, who was labelled a sinner. Well, actually, whether you take it that it was Mary, as in the sister of Lazarus and Martha, she was a sinner, because like each of us was a sinner. But here we have a woman that in other versions it talks about the woman as if she was a woman of the street. And she was, whatever she was, in a label of being, if you like to use degrees of being a sinner, she was this big a sinner, or this big a sinner, or she was this big a sinner. She was a sinner. And yet, here we have Jesus who even says, this woman, whose sins were many, her sins have been forgiven her. So even Jesus labelled, say even inverted commas, even Jesus labelled her a sinner. And here we have a woman of the street who came in and washed Jesus' feet, wiped them with the hair of her head, poured ointment on him, and she came and she was exposed. She was prepared to be exposed in front of a Pharisee and all Jesus' disciples and Jesus himself, and take the risk of being ridiculed, thrown out, strung up outside, simply because she wanted to express her love for Jesus. She was prepared to come as she was. Now sometimes there was a word this morning about not feeling worthy to come. This morning Scott said, stuff this week, I just don't feel worthy. Don't feel worthy to be a pastor, don't feel worthy to be a worship leader, but he still came. He came as he was. Despite his feelings, he still came. And each one of us, despite our feelings sometimes, you've still got to come. Or you could stay and sulk at home because you feel a sinner today. The next week you'll feel fine. So you'll come next week, and the following week you'll feel down, and the following week you'll feel up. So up, down, up, down, up, down, still come. You can still come as you are and express your love and adoration for Jesus. This woman was prepared to be exposed, but she still came as she was. She was open to criticism, but did it anyway. You know, there's that book that says, feel the fear and do it anyway. Well, sometimes you've got to take the risk and do it anyway. Take the risk of being ridiculed and pay the cost of coming, despite the fact that you feel negative, and do it anyway. The next E, exceptional. It was exceptional that this woman was prepared to spend a year's wage. It was well over and above the normal call of duty. Now, we have offerings, and we all give according to what you have, what you've received, and you put in. But here, we had a woman whose expression to Jesus was everything. And she gave a year's wages in one act that lasted maybe no more than 3-4 minutes. But it was an expression that she wanted. It was exceptional. It was well over and above the call of, quote, duty. If you want to take duty as being, well, I'll give you 10% and I'll give an offering and I'll do this and I'll do that, but that's it. That's fine. But actually here, and in our lives, there are times that we say, I'm going to do over and above the call of duty. Whether it's in a physical thing in terms of giving an offering or doing something practical that is actually over and above what people would normally expect them to do. But you're going to do it anyway because you make a choice and make a decision to do that. You could link this next X to it as well. Extreme. She went to an extreme. I mean, this woman comes into a Pharisee's house. Now that's like going into your local vicar's house or your local bishop's house. You know, it's the local bishop who covers the whole of, say, the Lichfield diocese, covers a big area and a lot of parishes. And a woman of the street walks in the house and gets down and wipes the feet and washes the feet of his visitor. That's extreme. That's really sticking their neck out. Are we prepared to be extreme enough to show our love for Jesus to that extent? This one, I'm pushing the limits on this little word. Expansionist. And the reason I'm pushing the limits on it is because the word magnify doesn't fit in. Because it's not going to begin with the X. But expansion. Expansionist. This woman was prepared and willing to honour Jesus and magnify him. We talk about magnify the Lord with me. Well, actually, in a sense, we can't make Jesus any bigger than he is. He is already the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But actually, you can actually magnify him and make him big in your eyes, over and above everything else. So actually, saying before, stuff happens. And sometimes stuff that happens to us clouds our vision of Jesus. Doesn't it? Realistically. Because stuff happens to the point you think, I've said this before, I can't see how even God can sort this out. And the strange thing is, when you get to that point, you can't even see where God can sort it out, and that's when God sorts it out. Because sometimes he needs you to come to the end of yourself and figuring out how this could possibly be done, that only God can now do it. And sometimes we do reach the point where you think, I can't even see how God can do this. And then only God can do it, so only God does it. But it actually is a place that we have got to magnify him above the situation. So even if there's stuff happening in your life that you can't figure out how it's going to get sorted out, how you can sort it out, how the pastor can sort it out, how the Archbishop of Canterbury can possibly sort it out, and how even God can sort it out, you still have to make a decision that I'm going to magnify him, an expansionist. I'm going to expand him and my view of him above the situation and above the criticism that could possibly happen to me and above my own feelings and about my own ups and downs of this. Now it's up to you. And here we have a woman who came to Jesus and washed his feet in front of other people because she was prepared to magnify him bigger than him. Would she have done it to the Pharisee? No. Would she have done it to the high priest? No. Who was the one that she was prepared to do it to? Jesus. Each one of us has to make that decision and that choice in our own lives to build him up above what he would do for anybody else. Here's one that I hope will be an eye-opener for you as well as for me. Extrovert, and I'll put / introvert. We all meet extroverts. I would generally be described as an extrovert, but I'm not an over-expressive person in terms of some of the things I do. I don't tend to be the one who would leap and dance around the room. And that is not me. I'm not an expressive person in that way. But extra, like last week, for instance, if this is being recorded, then maybe this little bit. But I'm not going to be derogatory. But Cedric, last week, those who were here on Saturday night, Cedric is an extrovert. He just doesn't care. He just goes ahead and does it anyway. And there are times that I would be like that. But you may be an introvert, and you may be quiet, you may be reserved, maybe you wouldn't be the person who'd stand and go, "Hallelujah!" and dance around the room. Or, like Cedric last week, Cedric is an expressive extrovert. But actually, strangely enough, when he comes to the leaders' days at UCB, he doesn't tend to be quite as extroverted as that. Not usually, although if you give him an inch, he will stand up on a chair and he'll worship, and he will, but he's an extrovert. You may be an introvert, but either way, you've got to find a way of expressing what's on the inside of you. An expressive extrovert or an expressive introvert. One way or the other. I remember there was a preacher who used to come around here years ago called Derek Gitchin. And he's still around, he's still ministering. But Derek used to use a phrase. He said, you need to find a place that you can express your love for Jesus Christ, or you will be the most frustrated person in the world. Because if you have that love for Jesus on the inside, and you're not expressing it in some way, shape or form, you're actually going to be pushing it down. Because if you have a day-to-day, lively, life-giving relationship with Jesus, you'll want to express it in some way, shape or form. If you're a married man or woman, there are times that you want to express it. You don't walk down the road all the time and go, "Darling, I love you so much." But there are times that you want to say, "Darling, I love you so much," or in other words or in other ways. You need to be expressive. You need to find a way of being expressive to Jesus. To be able to express one way or the other. And sometimes you have the difference between expressive and non-expressive. You have the difference between being practical or being, if you like, reserved, or even, you could put in brackets there, theoretical. But I'd say I'm not an over-expressive person, but there has to be a place that I have to find of being practical and doing and saying. There are also people who you'll find will spend, and I'm not criticising here, but there are people who will spend 5, 6, 10, 20 hours a week in their closet praying. And that's great, if that's what God's called you to. But there are people who will be out there doing it. They'll spend time in the closet, but they'll be out there doing it. And both are valuable, both are doing. But if you're spending 20 hours a week in your closet and not doing anything, there's something wrong. Because we all need to find an outward expression of the time you've spent in the closet. Jesus says about, don't stand on the street corner praying out to everybody to hear to make a big show so that everybody says, "Oh, what a wonderful prayer." But actually, go in your closet and pray. But the purpose of that was so that when you came out of the closet, you were actually able to express something and do something on a practical basis. So when you're an introvert or an extrovert, find a way that you'll actually do something and express your love for Jesus Christ on the outside. And the next one is really, in a sense, is linked to that, and that's experimental. Don't limit Jesus, and don't limit your expression of your love towards Jesus to being the normal, living your life by the status quo. Find a place that you can actually be experimental in the way that you worship. So, I'm sure that the songs that you sang this morning were not exactly the same songs as you sang last week. I'm sure that they won't be the same songs as you sing next week, but I may be wrong. Exactly. He doesn't know, because next week's a different week. And he'll find another way. Scott will find another way. And I thought it went great this morning with keyboard as well. That was really good. That really just blended. But it's an expressive. I've not heard you guys play together before. It may be, for me, to this morning, first time, it was experimental. It was something that was different than I normally experienced here. But find a way that is actually experiment with something new, something different. And I'm not saying that corporately or only corporately. I'm saying that with you and I individually. Find a way of being expressive in your love for Jesus, and try something different. The status quo, I think it was said in, I think it was in the Word for Today recently. It was, in other words, means the mess we're in. It's the same state all the time, carrying on and on and on. And the status quo, I used to love Come On Sweet Caroline and the old status quo stuff. But actually, the status quo gets boring. Status quo is just like da 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 da, and it's like the status quo songs. Whenever you hear status quo play, you know it's status quo. As soon as, if you've listened to old status quo stuff from 30 years ago and you hear them play something new now, you know immediately it's status quo. That should not be what our lives are like. The first thing you open your mouth, everybody knows it's so-and-so and they're praying now. It's exactly the same thing as they did last week. It's exactly the same lifestyle that they do all the time. Find some way of being experimental. Go out your way to find a place of being expressive in your love for Jesus and your adoration and your love for him, your gratitude towards him. Everything we do should be an expression of our worship. Whether that is a case of coming along to Jesus and wiping his feet, and washing his feet and pouring ointment over his feet. Take that as an analogy, or take that as an example of what this woman did. But actually for you and for me, it'll be different each day. In this particular case, it was the woman did something expressive with a jar of ointment, with the tears from her eyes, with the hair of her head. I don't think she was likely to come back the following Sunday and do exactly the same, or the following day and do exactly the same. She found a way different every day. If Jesus was there every day, I'm sure she didn't sneak in every day, every morning into Simon the Pharisee's house and cry over Jesus' feet and wipe his feet with the hair of her head. She would find a different way of being expressive. Experiment. Jesus is happy to see you. Surprise him. You can surprise Jesus by actually being expressive in a different way than you did it last week, or you did it yesterday. And these are just some things that came to me when I was thinking about the way that this woman, one of these stories there, Jesus actually said, this woman and what she has done will be spoken about wherever the gospel is preached. You know, that was how important Jesus saw it. That the woman's expression was so fantastic. Simple act of washing somebody's feet. Jesus said, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, 7 billion population in the world now, maybe somewhere in the region of say 2.5 billion people will be professing Christians. And every single place that they are meeting, at some point, Jesus said, this woman will be spoken about. Her expression of Jesus towards Jesus was so unique and so fantastic that it wasn't unique and fantastic. It became an expression of a heart that was on the inside of her that burned with love for Jesus. What are we doing in terms of our expression for Jesus? Do it with a practical thing, do it with a holistic thing that says, well, the whole of my life is yours, Jesus. I'm going to find some way different today to show you my love. And do it, be there, wash his feet, whether it's with your acts, or whether it's with your tears, whether it's with your heart, and it always comes from a heart that loves him. Bless you. Amen.